I'm Dave Fieldman, Village Manager. This is Mike Baker, Deputy Village Manager. This is Judy Butney, our Finance Director. Mayor, any comments before we roll?
Well, first of all, I think the Village Council ought to have the opportunity to introduce themselves, so I'll start. Obviously, most of you hopefully know who we are. Good morning. My name is Martin Tully. I'm the Mayor of Village Downers Grove. It's my privilege to call this budget meeting to order. I'll let my colleagues introduce themselves, starting with Marilyn Schnell.
We have to stand.
You don't have to.
I'm Marilyn Schnell. I'm on the Village Council.
Bill Waldeck, Village Council.
Becky Rankin.
I'm Bob Barnett, and thank you everybody for coming.
I'm Sean, I'm the head teller.
Jeff Newstead,
And
thanks for
ATM.
coming. And seriously, since this is all being recorded for broadcast on our cable channel and streaming video, I think it's important that everybody identify themselves, so thank you everyone for doing that. Because everyone here might know who we are, but everyone at home may not. So those tuning in, thank you for tuning in, because this is a beginning of a long and important process. As we discussed, I think, at our last council meeting on Tuesday, the first budget meeting is really a series of meetings that we will have as a council and staff and as a community, candidly, to talk about how we're going to finance the projects that have been determined by a lot of effort, discussion, and deliberation by council and staff over the next year, and in this case it will be fiscal 2013. The village operates on a calendar fiscal year running from January 1 through December 31st. And so we have these meetings in advance of an adoption of an official budget later in the year. One of the things that is beneficial about the long-term planning that the village engages in, both from a financial and a strategic standpoint, is that by the time we come to this budget meeting, I think what you'll find is, for the most part, the budget reflects a number of policy decisions that have previously been discussed and through discussion and consensus agreed upon, at least in terms of a organizational approach. And now we're talking about how we go about being good stewards of the community's tax dollars and putting those plans into action, and ultimately it will lead to a budget that we'll adopt, and then again you'll see implemented over the course of 2013. So with that introduction, we will turn things back over to Village Manager David Fieldman for a presentation of the proposed fiscal 2013 budget.
Well, Martin, you've taken almost all the introductory comments right out of our presentation, so we'll do a little ad-libbing here. The mayor just talked about how the budget is really the product of planning efforts, and here they are on the screen, many, many plans: long-range financial plan, stormwater utilities, stormwater master plan, watershed infrastructure improvement plan, water rate study. You get the picture? Many, many planning documents that are being implemented. The council's been talking about these plans for years, and the budget and long-range financial plan implement many of these planning documents. So we'll go a little out of order here. The mayor also mentioned several opportunities for public input. We're going to be talking about the budget and related items starting today and rolling through mid-December. So many, many opportunities. There are really four key points to this year's budget. Number one, it implements the stormwater utility. This implementation reflects three policy decisions made in 2012 and affects many portions of the budget. There are 5 major impacts occurring in 3 funds, and these impacts will be discussed throughout the morning. In fact, Mike Baker's going to track them right over here, and he's going to use a diagram on the whiteboard. And by the end of the presentation this morning, the impacts of implementing the utility should be apparent. So that's the first point. It implements the stormwater utility. The second point is it reduces the property tax levy by $1.98 million. That's right, property taxes for the village are going down again for the second year in a row. Reduces the property tax levy by $1.98 million. It includes a balanced general fund. We are financially sound. Revenues equal to expenses. And it allows us to continue in infrastructure investment, something we've been working on for many years. This budget is a plan for how we will use village financial resources in 2013. However, there are risks to this plan, this budget. Many revenue sources are outside of the village's direct control. The state controls many of the village revenues, and actions by the General Assembly could reduce village revenues. Many revenues are also related to economic conditions, and changes in the economy could reduce our revenues. But we do have an action plan. We will continue to monitor and forecast We'll provide quarterly reports to the Village Council, and we are poised to make mid-year budget adjustments if necessary, both on the revenue side and on the expense side. Today we will be following a hard copy agenda. I hope everybody has a copy of it. We'll try to get out of here by 11:30 or so. We're going to present the funds in three categories. We'll start with the general fund and related funds. Then we'll work our way through infrastructure funds that we call enterprise and capital funds. And then we'll conclude with TIF district funds and other funds. We will take a break in between each of these three sections. And I wanted to let you know, for those of you who've been following us for years, Chris, Mark, others, this is a crazy idea, I know. We're presenting the budget in the same order as the budget book. So now we're actually going to start with section 4 of the budget. And as you follow along, you can actually flip through. So no more yelling out page numbers, et cetera. We'll work our way through. So trying to make it easier to understand and, frankly, make it more transparent. We're also trying to give specific examples in page numbers today. So you may hear some of the staff members as we're presenting call your attention to a particular line item or a particular page just to make sure we tie the book to the presentation. We're using a new bar chart to help explain the relationship of the funds. This bar chart also appears in the budget message. And it shows the revenues and expenses for each fund. And you can see on this chart the sort of order of magnitude, the difference between the fund sizes. It really shows you where we spend taxpayer dollars.
If I could jump in for a second. This is certainly something new people haven't seen before as part of the presentation. And part of the reason for including it is, we think, to make it a little easier to follow, again, as Dave said, to show the magnitude of the funds, just to make sure everyone knows what they're looking at. You're seeing revenues and expenses, revenues in light blue and expenses in a dark red or brown for each of the funds. And as we typically do, we'll start with general fund and work our way down. And you'll see this same graph reappear throughout the presentation, and we'll kind of track our progress as we make our way through the funds. So it actually appears on two separate slides, and this is the second slide with some of the funds that'll be discussed later on in the presentation this morning.
So we'll start with the first section, general fund and related funds. The general fund can be found on page 4-3 of your book, section 4-3. Everybody have a book that needs one in the audience? I'll wait for Ms. Frigo to nod. We got it? All right, here we go. Okay. The general fund is the village's main operating fund. It is supported by many revenue sources, and the vast majority of village services are provided through this fund. There are specific recommendations of our long-range financial plan that are being implemented in this FY2013 budget, much like many of the previous years. And those specific action items are up here on the screen. We're going to start by looking at general fund expenses. The top line on this graph, in blue, shows the general fund expenses over time. Top line in blue is the general fund expenses over time. The budgeted expenses are $41.6 million for this year, for FY2013. $41.6 million. That's the circled number on the top right there. Okay, that number, 41.6, is $1.1 million less than actual expenses in 2007. That was the year in which general fund expenses peaked. So we're going to spend $1.1 million less than we did in FY07. Now, those of you following us know that we are shifting with this year's budget. We're going to take stormwater-related expenses that were historically in the general fund, and we're shifting them over to the stormwater fund. This means that the general fund expenses have been reduced by $815,000 because of that shift. General fund expenses have been reduced by $815,000.
I'm actually going to take a moment and introduce how we're going to use the whiteboard now. We wanted to get a telestrator, but we couldn't afford it this year, so we're going to have to work from. But again, this is intended to just show the impacts and the effects of the stormwater utility, because it does affect multiple funds. You'll see, and as we go through the presentation of our funds today, the 5 impacts will be discussed. So they're written here for people who like to see the words, but we also have the visuals here, and I'm going to actually draw, as Dave just said, the $815,000 in expenses that are coming from the general fund into the stormwater utility fund. And then I'll just note that as impact number 1. And I'll continue to do that as we go through and hit all the other remaining impacts. So by the end of it, you'll get a full and complete picture of how the utility affects the 3 funds that are referenced here: general fund, stormwater fund, capital projects fund, and the policy actions that either have been taken or are due to be taken in 2012 that all relate to the activities within those funds. That make sense? Any questions?
Two things here I think are worth mentioning. Number one, it bears repeating that the reason why Mr. Baker is going through this is because obviously the adoption of a stormwater utility beginning in fiscal 2013 is a major change in how we fund a very important capital project, infrastructure project here in Downers Grove. And that has a number of impacts, as has been mentioned before, but to actually make sure everybody understands, both those here in the room and those who will be watching remotely, how that affects, how that new program affects the overall finances going forward, I think is really critical. Because we're talking about $815,000 less in expenses. Well, they're not really less in expenses, they're being moved over, so we're trying to be as transparent and open about how this actually impacts our overall funding going forward, because it does implement some very important changes. And the other thing that bears mentioning is that Mr. Baker has been practicing his handwriting for a week so that he won't have to use the eraser at all. I think that's very brave, but thank you.
So this means that the general fund expenses have been reduced by $815,000 because of the shift for the stormwater utility. But even without this shift in stormwater-related expenses out of the general fund, the expenses in FY13 would still be $275,000 less than we spent a full 6 years ago. Total expenses in the general fund are comprised of really 2 categories: personnel expenses and non-personnel expenses. The personnel expenses are shown in the middle green dashed line on the screen, and they account for about 78% of our total expenses in the general fund. All right, this should make some sense, right? Because we are a customer service organization, and we rely on people to provide these services. So it makes sense that personnel expenses account for most of our general fund budget. Now, personnel expenses include not only wages, but the cost of health benefits and post-employment benefits, pensions. These personnel expenses are budgeted to be $32.7 million in FY13. This is a 3.1% increase over last year's budgeted amount. But this increase is driven primarily by the cost of public safety pensions. The cost of those public safety pensions will be up over 13%, and we'll talk a little bit about that when we talk about our tax levy. Health benefit related expenses are up about 5%, which is significantly less than the national average, which is running around 9% increases. We can talk a little bit more about health expenses when we get to the health fund. Now, salary increases are budgeted to be 2%. These expenses have been controlled by favorable salary terms in the recent collective bargaining agreements that were approved in the last 12 months. Okay, non-personnel related expenses are shown in that red or orangish bottom line. They are budgeted to decrease by nearly $700,000. That's a reduction of over 7%. Okay, $400,000 of that reduction, though, is really a shift to the stormwater fund. $400,000 is the shift to the stormwater fund. It's part of that $815 we just talked about. But $300,000 of that reduction is a decrease due to the implementation of several long-range financial plan recommendations. Most importantly, the application of lean concepts that are being applied throughout the organization. Basically, we are finding less expensive ways to provide the services that are valued by our community. For those of you in the audience, if you want to look at the budget message, we actually put a couple of examples of the leaning of our organization in there to describe what's going on. So that's general fund expenses for FY13. I now want to look briefly at general fund revenues for FY13. Remember that there are multiple revenue sources that support the general fund. And the top line here in red shows the general fund revenues over time. Revenues for FY13 are budgeted to be $41.6 million, same as expenses. Now this number is down slightly from the last 2 years. Why? Well, we're going to take property tax revenue, $815,000 of property tax revenue, and shift it out of the general fund. This is because we are now using a fee-based system to pay for stormwater expenses, and we're no longer going to rely on a property tax-based system. So you can see the reduction in the property tax revenue, which is shown on the yellow line, sort of at the bottom portion of this graph. Mike Baker will now show you the second, actually it's part of the first.
Still part of the first impact, but remember we dropped or shifted the expenses from general fund to stormwater. Well, that doesn't mean we just left kind of money available in the general fund to redirect elsewhere. No, that's where the $815,000 reduction in the property tax levy that's corresponding shows up. So that completes the first impact.
So you can see how general fund revenues and expenses of $815,000 are shifting to the stormwater fund. Just finishing up on the balance of our revenue discussion in the general fund, most of the other revenue sources in the general fund are budgeted to increase slightly. I want to call your attention to sales tax revenue. Sales tax revenues are the blue line on this graph here. They are budgeted to increase modestly as the recent growth trend is expected to continue. And once again, for the first time in a couple of years, this means that sales tax revenues are now the top revenue source in the general fund. Sales tax revenues now again become the top revenue source in the general fund. At this point, I want to take some time to explain the proposed village property tax levy. There are many sources of revenue in the general fund, but property taxes are a major revenue source in the general fund. And it's true that a small amount of the tax levy actually is used in the capital fund, but most of the property tax revenue supports the general fund. Okay, there's tends to be a lot of confusion over tax bills and the village's role here. I just want to talk a little bit about some key concepts. The village levies a specific dollar amount. This means that the village receives the amount we levy. It doesn't matter if property values go up. It doesn't matter if property values go down or even stay the same. We levy an amount, we get that amount. The township assessor determines the value of properties that are located within the village that will be subject to the tax levy, the ones who will be paying their portion of the tax levy. The village does not levy a rate. The rate is simply determined mathematically by dividing what we levy by the taxable value of all properties in the village. Okay, so that's a little primer on property tax levy. But I want to take a minute to, with that explanation as a background, to walk through the village's proposed levy in 2013. Again, the village levies a dollar amount. And in 2012, we levied about $12.98 million, shown here at the bottom of this chart. In 2013, the proposed levy is just over $11 million. This is a reduction in the levy of about $1.98 million. Property taxes going down by 15%. But the total levy consists of several components, and we will fill in the chart as we talk about them. Two of the levy components will be decreased because of the village's implementation of the stormwater utility. The corporate levy, also known as the general levy, will be reduced by $815,000. That's the number we just talked about in the general fund revenues and expenses. The capital component of the levy will decrease by $1.66 million. This component of the levy used to be called stormwater because all of the money levied was used to make payments on the 2008 stormwater bonds. The village will not be using stormwater fees to make the remaining payments on the 2008 stormwater bonds. The total decrease in these two components due to the stormwater utility is $2.47 million.
So put that up on the board now. That actually is the second impact, which again takes the property tax revenue of $1.66 million reduction out of the stormwater fund, and when you combine it with the 815,000, what's the total?
2.47.
Total of 2.47 million.
So those are the two components that are going down and really drive the overall reduction in the tax levy, both due to the implementation of the stormwater utility. There are two components of the property tax levy that are going up. They are increasing. They both have to do with fire and police pensions. Remember that the village must levy a specific amount for contributions to the fire and police pension funds. These contributions are required by state law and are based on actuarial reports. The increase in the property tax levy this year for these required contributions is $497,000. The last component of our levy, called fire protection, actually remains unchanged. The net result of the two components up and the two components down is that property taxes will be $1.98 million less in 2013 than they were in 2012. The township,
Dave,
yes.
Can I interject just
Please.
real quick for anybody following along out of their book, or it's on page 5 of your management report?
That's correct.
That chart.
There's
So if
the
you wanna-
chart in the budget message, which is the first tab.
Okay, thanks.
Thanks, Bill. Okay, the township assessors who value the properties have indicated that the village's total taxable value is expected to decline by 7%. So with the village levy and the total EAV both going down, the village's tax rate also goes down. It's projected to decline from 0.5787 to 0.5215 in 2013. So now let's look at how those changes affect the typical property in the village of Downers Grove. With the drop in the levy and the drop in the EAV, the typical house in Downers Grove that's worth about $300,000 will pay about $485 in property taxes to the village in 2013, about $485. This is about $94 less than a typical property paid to the village in 2012. You're saying, Dave, you're crazy. That can't be right. I pay a lot more than $485 in property taxes. That's true. You do. But most of the property taxes you pay go to taxing bodies other than the village. There are many, many taxing bodies on a tax bill. We have an example up here. And the village accounts for only 3 line items, and it's only 10% of your total tax bill. So it is possible, and some would say likely, that even though we are dropping our tax levy and taxes paid to the village by about 15%, property owners could be paying more in their total tax bill. That has to do with actions of other taxing bodies, not the village. So in conclusion, in the general fund, we are a balanced budget with revenues and expenses of $41.6 million. We have controlled personnel expenses. Non-personnel expenses are decreasing. Revenues are also decreasing slightly, but a lot of that is due to the elimination of the property tax levy for stormwater and the shifting of revenues. And other revenues are increasing modestly, and this all results in almost a $1.98 million reduction in our tax levy.
Dave, can I ask a quick question?
Please.
I know in years past we've had the penny diagram, and I really think that's a good way to illustrate the slide that you just had on there before. Because we have gone down again, or proposed to go down again, can we recreate that penny diagram to have for correspondence for emails that come to us, and maybe to have on our website for folks to look at when they do get, you know, that information? I think it's a really helpful tool, and while it sounds silly as just a small picture, but it does tell the story. And if we use percentages on that diagram and the pieces of the penny, it really helps folks understand what that property tax bill is, because this is good news for our percentage of the property tax bill. Who knows what everybody else is doing? So I think if any way that we can get that out would be real helpful.
We will do so.
It sounds like a good idea.
That actually concludes our presentation, so any questions?
Can I add one more thing? On page 6 of the management report, I happen to catch a typo. And it's a typo because your chart was right, your table 2 chart, but when you, just above it, the verbiage is, you have 484.99 as opposed to 484.49. So when I did the subtraction at the top, it didn't come out to the 94.21. Just a minor item.
Thank you.
And then the other thing is, over the years, I've been trying to show the relationship between, whatever amounts of money we're talking about, whether it's revenue or expenditure, whatever. I use $25,000 as a guide. For every $25,000 that we spend, excuse me, it's about $1 on the tax bill. And the way the math comes out this time around, it's more like $21,000. So for every $21,000 we spend, it's almost like the equivalent of a dollar on the tax bill, or $1 in something, tax bill. So if that helps. Thanks.
Can you also, I assume you're probably going to do this when you go through the pension funds themselves, but when you do, can you kind of highlight the reasons why
Sure.
There was an increase in the property tax? I know it's easy to say it's just because of actuarial studies, but I think for the residents to understand that there are certain decisions that are made during that whole process and what those decisions are. And then, again, when you go through the pension funds, could you also talk a little bit about, I guess, to educate people, because it's been such a hot topic, and I guess there was an overflow crowd at the League of Women Voters pension thing. If you could just kind of highlight the fact that it isn't just the village government that's putting monies into the pension fund, but it's actually the employees as well as the employer, and kind of relate. I know I asked those questions, and they're in the questions and answers, but again, to highlight, I think, for the audience, exactly how our pension funds work.
Well, let's take a minute right now to do this, because it's right on topic.
I think it's interesting information, and I think it's information that our residents need to understand.
And it affects our levy, so let's just take a few minutes right now to do that. I want to start by saying we have some good news in the police and fire pension funds. Overall, they are in great conditions. Both funds are extremely healthy. They're exceptionally well managed. The village contributes 100% of the required funding to the funds. That is not the case in all the towns in Illinois. We're proud to say that we do that. The ratio of plan assets to annual benefits paid, how much money's in the bank compared to how much these funds have to pay out each year, is 16-to-1, which is an outstanding ratio. What that can tell everybody is the things you've been hearing on the news about the insolvency of state pension funds is not true in Downers Grove. However, you did see the increase here of about 13% in the contributions to these levies. This is affected by two things. One is the return in the markets of these funds investments. Remember, they're 1 year delayed in the reporting. So 2011, if you had investments in your personal things, you know that that was a challenging year. And because those investments didn't perform to the actuarial model, they returned quite a bit less. The village has to make up that difference in market performance by levying dollars. And that's where the state law requires us to do this. So that's why there's a significant increase. Going forward, these funds have been performing better in the investment markets. I don't think you'll see quite this dramatic increase next time. Also, there was an adjustment to the assumption in the models. Also had to do with the investment returns. You have to make sure that whatever you put in the model on investment returns is actually being achieved over the long term. And the return in the model was pretty high still, and that's not happening in the market. So both of these funds reduced that assumption by 0.25%. What you need to know about that is it requires the village to make up the difference. And that's what you're seeing here. And finally, the contributions, yes, the members, the employees that are in these funds also contribute. It's not just their investment returns and village contributions. Police contribute 9.91% of their salaries, and fire contribute 9.455. Those amounts are set by the state, so I don't know exactly how they came up with 9.91 and 9.455, but they are in the state law.
Okay, and then, excuse me, historically, if the rate of return is equal or better what the assumption is, it's conceivable that next year the tax rate would go down. And I know you have a chart somewhere that shows the last 10 years or something, and I apologize for this, and we can do this when we go through the pension fund. But you can actually see in those charts, some years there's a huge increase, some years there's not as much, and it depends really on a lot of excuse me, a lot of factors. This year being the fact that rate of return wasn't one.
We went ahead and put that up here on the screen for you, Commissioner Chanel. And a couple of notes. You see the slope of the increase over time from 2000 to 2013 is generally about the same, except for two blips where it goes down. The first blip in about 07, 08 had to do with our stub year when the village changed from a May 1 fiscal year to a January fiscal year, and that affected the timing of when we levied. And so there's an artificial dip and then an artificial recovery in the next year. And then last year, you'll see it dip again, and that's because of pension reform laws that happened at the state, which allowed not only our pension funds, but some others as well, to not levy as much as they took advantage of those laws.
And it's also important to note that both the manager and Judy, I think, sit on those police and fire pension boards. Dave is a new addition. Judy has been there forever. And that keeps us as a village staff, along with the employees, in line and giving ourselves the right amount of information. So when we do get to this point, I'm very confident in conversations I've had with the manager that we are being very responsible with not only our portion of the pension levy, but then the employee portion as well, to make sure all those dollars are being put in the right way, and we have good actuarials, we have good information that we're using to make our assumptions and our options as we go forward. So I think that addition and having the two key staff members on those pension boards are really important.
Just to add two things, I tend to view the whole pension levy topic sort of like someone who's been asked to take a bow and arrow, aim at and hit a target. And the target is set by the state, and we're required by law to hit that target. But the timing of the target, the distance of the target, whether you get to use a bow or an arrow or something else, or whether there's a tree in the way, those are things that keep changing all the time based on economic performance, based on legislation in Springfield, based upon a lot of other factors. And every year we have to look at those factors and still make sure that we can hit that target. And that's why we're required to make these adjustments, whether it's in funding, whether it's in calculations, whatever it is, we're still required to hit that target. But the rules of the game change based on various external factors, which I think is the key thing for our residents to understand, that those are external factors, and we still have to meet that goal and hit that target. The other question I just want to ask is, obviously I think it's a good thing, and obviously I'm very proud of the fact that we're handling these responsibly in terms of funding them at the required levels. But a cynic out there might say, well, wait a minute, why is Downers Grove funding these fully when nobody else is? Why am I having to pay the full boat when everybody else is getting away without doing it? Why can't we also be irresponsible?
Couple of thoughts on that.
Well, we're mandated by law.
We're mandated by law. And
Doesn't stop the other communities.
And the vast majority of communities in Illinois, to my understanding, are making the required contributions. A lot of the confusion comes in between the difference between the state pension funds and the local public safety pension funds. The municipalities are mandated to, as Sean just said. Most of the municipalities make the payments. There are a handful that we've become aware of that haven't made the recommended and required payments, and they've ended up in some legal discussions.
That's why I raised the question.
So you can, those wanting to look at that could probably Google up some interesting court cases on that, but we're aware of a few that have gotten into some challenges because they didn't do what was required. Other questions or comments from the council on the general fund?
Well, only one other thing, and just to pick up on Jeff's comment about the penny, which I think is a good idea to include that, sort of that penny pie graph, if you will. Some other cynics might say, well, that's great about the real estate levy, but there's a lot more that is involved in the cost of living in Downers Grove other than just the real estate levy. There's the stormwater utility, there's the water costs, there's sales tax, there's a lot of other things. Not right now and not today, but it might be a good idea at some point in time to sort of come up with a, we have the average cost for the average home, for the average family from a real estate standpoint. And you're already going to find that chart by the time I'm done talking. Yes, we'll get to this later, but sort of, what is a typical house in Downers Grove? What does it cost a typical house in Downers Grove to live in Downers Grove? So that we're, again, being comprehensive and yes, we're very proud of the fact that the property tax levy is going down, but be mindful of the fact that there are other fees and costs so that folks can see we're not just moving things around and getting you, not getting you in one place, but getting you in another place. We're actually trying to be good stewards all across the board comprehensively, and I did talk long enough for you to put that chart up,
right.
so thank you.
And if you keep talking, you actually walk everybody through it, so. Mayor's, and I have talked many times about this. So
But Commissioner Durgan doesn't realize that we're trying to get to that 11 o'clock rather than 11:30, but I'm happy to stay here till 11:30.
I'm looking for 10:30.
The village has taken several key actions in the last 12 months or so. The one we just talked about is the upcoming reduction in our property tax levy, which saves the average or typical house in Downers Grove about $95 a year. We are also implementing a stormwater utility in 2013. People will start paying monthly, actually billed bi-monthly fees for stormwater. The typical house is in what we call Tier 2, the mid-range, based on impervious area. And they'll pay about $101 a year in those fees. The village also participated in electrical aggregation this year, which resulted in less expensive electricity supply for the people in our village that chose to participate in this, that did not opt out. That typical house will save about $350 a year on their electric bill. Later in this presentation, when we get to the water fund, you'll see that we are continuing with a plan to raise water rates to make sure we invest in our water system. The impact of that on a typical house is an increase of about $90 per year. All in, all four of these actions result in a net savings to the typical house next year of about $250. So some of this will become more apparent as we work our way through other fund presentations today, but four actions resulting next year in a savings to a typical house.
But it's not just those four actions. It's, this was going to be one of my closing comments, but on the bottom of page 6, it kind of sums up the whole budget. And you started your presentation with this, is that this is a culmination of a lot of, I think it says 4 budgets that now follow the LRFP. And we're at a point now with change to not only things like we're looking up here, but also our services, our programs, involuntary, voluntary staffing, changes, reductions. I am really just reading right off the budget thing here. I'm trying to remember it though. Because of those changes, the structural gap in the general fund was eliminated. And then I'll skip to the bottom sentence. Because of these appropriate actions were taken, the village was well positioned for the FY2013 budget. So all of that together really puts us in this position to have another great budget, but also still deliver the public safety and public services that we have to and we should be at a great level, but we're not going backwards or forward. We're in a good spot, and I know some of my colleagues might say, well, why don't we increase those services, or why don't we add, why don't we take away? But I think where we are right now is kind of the right spot, for my opinion. And these budgets have formed and changed in a way that gets us to be in a good spot where we can offer a little bit of a savings with even some unique revenue and expense options that are out there. So,
Just to answer your question, I think one of the reasons why we probably couldn't add more services at this point in time is because we really don't know what's going to happen with the state.
That's correct.
The state could very easily take away some of the revenues that are in our budget that we should be getting, but they may need in order to bridge their budget gap, which is really bad. So,
That could happen next year.
It could happen tomorrow, if they're in session. I mean, we just don't know, and I think we need to be very frugal, and we need to be very careful. And I'm sure that's where you were getting to.
But
the bottom line is, we just don't know what the state will do.
but our services in the top 3, police, fire, public works,
Right.
water delivery, those kind of things, we're delivering those at an exceptional rate as outlined in our strategic plan. So there's another plan, I don't know if that was on the
Yeah.
original list, but that shows what we're supposed to do as a municipality. And then, of course, all the other departments that are here and are feeding into that very important top 3, I guess, and we all have our own roles, but those services are right on par with what a municipality our size should be doing. Response times, snow removal, water delivery
Probably
quality,
better
things
than-
like that, and better than many. So that's kind of the point I was getting at, is that where we are right now, for my 2 cents, is really, is it a great spot.
The, one thing that we gotta all make sure we don't lose sight of, and I think it's important for our residents to understand too, though, is that whether we're in a good spot or whether we're subject to state risk, that's all obviously true. But this only works, and this only has worked because our staff and everybody that works here from council down has embraced this whole lean thing. I mean, this is a message that's got a lot of pieces to it, and certain parts probably jump out to different individuals, but the fact that 78% of our cost is still payroll is a big deal, and the reason this is working is because we're still down 10% as compared to 2009 in terms of number of folks out delivering those services. And so that has got to continue whether we get help from the state or a black eye from the state, or whether we decide to increase services or not. That philosophy and that mentality about how to provide those services and how to function as an organization is the key to making this thing healthy. There's lots of good to be taken out of this, but when you start looking at those revenue streams, but for home real sales tax, they're not going to keep up with even modest raises. So it's, you got a 10-year rate of increase that's somewhere around 3%, and you got 6 or 5 over 3 years on the 78% of your cost side. So it's just really critical that we stay focused on the lean efforts, whether it's, the top 4 things: increasing operating efficiencies, reducing personal expenses, partnering with others, and adjusting fees. Those 4 elements have got to be constantly in focus, because we are going to be demanded to provide better services. People are not likely to think yesterday was good enough under any set of circumstances. And 78% of the cost is continuing to climb.
Question about the unemployment rate?
No, nothing to do with unemployment.
What are you talking about yesterday?
When I say yesterday, what I'm saying is I think most residents expect, like we're doing now with streets, instead of having 1/3 of our streets fall apart, to have less than that next year. And all of those services, whatever they are, it was 3 years ago with stormwater, now it's streets. There's going to be some new focus in the next 2 years, and still 78% of our cost base is going to go up 3% or so.
Yeah, without a doubt.
Not to throw a cold blanket on it, but
But that-
No, I don't think it's a cold blanket at all.
78% is operating at A level.
it is, and it has to stay.
And we still haven't really talked what really the difference between A level and B level is.
Well, the Commissioner Barnett's point is that these strategies have been successful, and we need to keep pursuing them as vigorously as we have in the past. That's really the point.
I don't want anybody, I was starting to hear things that sounded very comfortable. And I think comfortable is deadly to an organization that has a cost structure that's, as ours is, and a revenue base that's as demanding as our residents are.
What I would, fair point. What I would take away from this is that the strategies that have been implemented have been successful, and that is all the more reason to continue pursuing them as vigorously as before. Because you're right, that 78% keeps going. So we have to keep going as vigorously as we can with everything else.
There's a bunch of staff members in the room that really get to take credit for the leaning of this organization. There's been complete buy-in and sort of a energy that comes with working at the Village of Downers Grove every day of trying to find better ways. And if you get a chance at the break, you can talk to any one of these staff members. They'll have a handful of stories about how they've leaned their department as part of the strategy. So absolutely focused on those lean concepts. Other questions, comments, or concerns in the general fund?
Just a comment. I do agree with a statement that Bob made. I think what was acceptable 20, 30, even 40 years ago with this village, with the residents that live there, and what is acceptable now is not the same. I think there are, as Bob said, I think there are greater expectations. There are expectations as far as stormwater, as far as streets, and whatever the expectations are 5 or 10 years from now. I think the challenge to this council and other councils is going to be able to meet those expectations within a financial framework that works. And we need to be very careful that we don't get to the point where the village is either overtaxing, overspending, over-borrowing, all of those things. There has to be a balance, and I think that's what we've tried to do over the last 3 or 4 years, is to balance spending, doing, what people want. Some people don't think we're doing it fast enough, but there is a challenge in that. And expectations have changed dramatically over the years. And I think in order to meet those expectations, not only do we have to change, but we have to be very frugal as to, or careful as to how we change. So.
Absolutely.
we still on the overview of the general fund, or we're going to be
That's
talking?
the general fund. We're ready to go on to health and risk if you'd like.
And just one thing, and that's with respect to my favorite topic when it comes to the general fund, which is the other financial uses. And I appreciate the additional information regarding interfund transfers, how and why these transfers are calculated. And for those who are following along at home, for example, on page 4-3 of the budget document, under the general fund category, line item 24, there's a segment called other financial uses, and you'll see that there's $200,000 of fiscal 11 and 12, and estimate for 12, and so on and so forth, as an example. And I know that these interfund transfers the general fund has to support certain other funds, like the water fund, for example, because the water fund is a fund and it needs to have certain administrative support in order to do its job cleanly. And therefore, there are some transfers that are made out of the general fund over into that fund, and vice versa. The question always raises, well, aren't you just taking from these other funds to help balance the general fund, and isn't that just an accounting maneuver in order to make things look good? And so I always ask the question, how can we articulate why that is done and the way in which it is done? And I appreciate the additional information. I understand that that is all governed by generally accepted accounting principles. And not today, but at some point in time, I'd still like to actually go through one of those calculations, because I understand that there are rules to these kinds of things.
Yeah.
But I would still like to be able to fully understand so that I can articulate and explain to those who ask out in our constituency, why was that amount moved here? Was that just moved because you needed to make the numbers work, or is that based on some kind of calculation? Picking up on the questions regarding the pension. What do you mean? You say actuarial numbers. Is that just a fancy accounting word, or is there really something that's driving that? And how do I know that those accounting rules are being employed properly to justify those numbers? Likewise here, I understand that there are rules to these kind of things, but I'd still like to be able to understand exactly how, why was this amount of revenue taken, say, from the water fund to offset the support that the general fund expenses would otherwise have been employed to make sure that the water fund does what it's supposed to do.
The easiest way to explain it is there are people like me and Judy and Mike and others in this room that are sort of charged out. Their expenses are charged in the general fund.
Right.
But we spend some time on other funds. And so
Right.
if you think of it like a consulting firm, you would track hours and charge out rates and you move it. Now, it's not that down to the penny because we're not a consulting firm, but we apply those concepts.
Right. You don't bill by the hour, so
Right.
it's not that easy.
Right, but the concept is as simple as what are you working on, what expenses need to move from one fund to the other to make sure they meet accounting principles. And we are subject to a financial audit every year, and they look for those things to make sure that those decisions are sound, predictable, and aren't moving funds around to balance budgets, et cetera. I do want to point out, you brought up line 24 on page 4.
That was a bad example, I understand.
Right, so this is actually a great example. This is an example where we, for several years, we're taking $200,000 out of the general fund and moving it into the risk fund, in addition to the normal allocations like the consulting firm example, because we had some challenges in the risk fund. You're going to hear today that we are taking steps to improve the risk fund, and so we don't have to make that transfer anymore, and that's why that number went to 0 this year. So we will post information on our website about the concept that the mayor's talking about. So if you're interested in that and want to see how that works, you can follow along with us.
Right, and I understand that, for example, if the auditors would probably flip out if they saw that 100% of your compensation was being allocated to the water fund or something like that,
That
would
is
probably
correct. It
not
is
meet
not.
muster. There are rules for
Right.
these kinds of things, but I think it's important, as Commissioner Schnell mentioned, when it comes to other topics, to be able to try to articulate, why is this being done within the appropriately professional parameters that have been established by professional accounting organizations.
Absolutely.
I'd like to just thank you for including this section now, this noteworthy changes, so we can follow along what the difference are. And that's kind of what the mayor was talking about, but that's a great resource to see the changes, so, thank you.
Dave, I got one other thing.
Sure.
Just if you'll indulge me for a minute before we get too far away from the property tax discussions. We've worked pretty hard in trying to change or in kind of implement a culture of lean. And with any cultural change comes changes in the lexicon, the terminology and the use of words. So I just encourage, we've worked for a few years now to try and continue to expand the understanding of what a property tax bill looks like, that there's, 7,500 other agencies that are also taxing people. And so as folks familiar with this process, residents who have followed it and staff and council are discussing things with our residents and neighbors, starting to try and work on the idea, most taxes are taxed on some sort of transactional value. And there's not really a transactional value for owning a house. Property taxes are the method of allocating cost of service. And I know that everybody in this room understands that fully. I don't doubt that for a minute. But I'm not sure that a lot of folks who aren't really paying attention to budget processes and taxes do. And the more we understand that, I think the more the whole budget process, the more people's tax bills, the more LRFP processes start to make sense over time. And we start to get away from questions like, well, my house is worth less, how come I'm paying more? That needs to get away from I think the core, and too often that's the core of people's complaints, the core of their understanding. And so if we can work on the idea that this is the allocation of the cost of providing service, it has nothing to do with the transactional value, potential transactional value of your house. It's a simple sentence, but I'd encourage everybody to try and process that and then throw it back out there as they discuss things.
Mayor, any other questions or comments from Jonathan?
Anything others from the council before? All right, thank you. Are there any questions with respect to the general fund from any members of the audience? Please come down to the microphone. The custom is to give your name and address.
Morning.
Good morning and welcome.
How are you? Chris Frigo, 1918 Elmore Avenue. One comment and one question while we're on the general fund. One comment, might be a good time to remind residents about what you had mentioned, that there is an email address you could write to say how much will my property tax go down, how much will I be impacted by the stormwater fund. I sent a note, I got a very quick response. I requested more detail, got that back, but it's kind of a good time to maybe, as you're talking about that, to remind people, because it's still kind of abstract to a lot of folks, that they can kind of estimate for your own home what it will be by address. So just a suggestion, you might want to share that with people at home. The other am I stealing more of your?
No, keep going. I thought you would give the email address, which is swutility at downers.us.
Right.
swutility at downers.us.
I thought I was missing a vowel there. The other thing was just a question. In the other funds, in the general fund, I know I sat through when the consultant came and gave us all the options about the stormwater utility and was explaining everything, and we've now said that we're going to allocate certain personnel and it's not going to be a huge thing. Are there line items in the general fund, I don't know if it's in that other one that's mandated, that will apply to the possibility of more staff and being needed for the stormwater utility outside of that fund, that come from the general fund as a backup in case we find out administrating it?
All the new staff will be charged and accounted for in the stormwater fund. It'll be an enterprise fund.
Right.
And you'll see in the budget message that we're adding a half-time GIS person charged directly to that stormwater fund.
I just didn't know if that had changed, or if we, as we're getting into it, seeing it's going to require more people, more time, and if that was one of the
It has not
options out of the general
so
fund.
far, and it will not affect the general fund because we're going to put it all in that
in
stormwater
the
fund.
enterprise fund. Got it.
There are a couple of part-time employees that will be paid for out of the stormwater fund this year as we create this utility. They are temporary. They'll be on just as we launch, and then
As it's set up.
they're just temporary employees, and they'll fall off. So they're all accounted for in the stormwater fund.
All right, thank
Chris,
you.
on 4-21, there's a pretty good explanation of the staffing for the stormwater.
I hadn't gotten there. I was just when we were
But
looking at other things, line 24 and stuff.
The great new thing about the new budget document is that noteworthy changes, and your question is answered right in here with the amount of staff and everybody that's being added, so it's a great resource.
I wasn't that far ahead.
I jumped ahead, sorry. I had the same question, that's why I just couldn't find 443, I had to find the page.
All right, thanks.
But the other question that was in there, and thank you, Ms. Frigo, the other question was in there is, I think in the question and the answer were both related to this concept of other financial resources and other financial uses. And right now, we're saying that there aren't going to be any other financial resources or the financial uses affecting the general fund with respect to the new stormwater utility fund.
That's correct.
It's going to be solely contained within the stormwater fund. So it is not contemplated right now that there will be these other financial resources or financial uses that involve the interfund transfers.
Right. Nothing above and beyond the sort of consulting firm model I talked about.
Right.
But the 815 that's being transferred from the general fund to the stormwater fund is kind of an interfer transfer, because those are expenses that are coming out of the general fund going into the stormwater fund.
Right, but since it's a change in our model, they won't actually flow through the general fund at all. They will
Okay,
never
no,
hit the general fund. It's a
but
switch
from
between
a-
12 and 13, right?
From a person point of view now,
Right.
they are. for
Right,
moving.
exactly.
Other questions? Good morning.
Good morning, folks. Tom LaCren, 545 Chicago Avenue. I just have a quick question. It's not for next year, but when are we going to see these electricity bills go down? I just got my September bill and it's still going to ComEd. It's not,
We'd like to take a look at your bill, Tom, if you want to bring it in. My bill already showed the change, so I
Mine
wanted
doesn't.
to take a look. So we'll-
I received mine.
yeah, mine
What month
doesn't, mine
the bill
doesn't show
was
it.
for, 'cause
There's
mine
diff-
didn't reflect the change.
There's different billing cycles that happen throughout the village, so it may be your billing cycle is a little later in the year or in the month. So if you take a look at it, we'll be happy to let you know.
Thank you.
Other questions from members of the audience with respect to the general fund overview? All right, well, thank you for those so far.
All right. Here's the graph again, and we will now move on to a couple of the other funds related to the general fund. These funds are related primarily because they rely on charges to the general fund as a primary source of revenue. Now, these are direct charges, so this is not the interfund transfer concept we were talking about a little bit earlier. The first two we'll discuss are health insurance and risk management. For both health and risk, the village is self-funded, which means that we are responsible for how the funds are managed and assume most of the costs or liability that appear as expenses in these funds. The village does maintain coverage to protect ourselves from catastrophic claims, and we have taken several steps to control costs, at the same time ensure that we are promoting employee well-being. So if you, seems like most people have flipped already to the right page. We're on 4-6 for health insurance. You can see them both listed here, but we'll start with health insurance, and then if there are any questions when I get done with my brief summary, we can take those at that time. The health insurance fund expenses have risen from an estimated $6.1 million in 2012 to a 2013 budget of $6.4 million. This increase is actually approximately 5%, which, as Dave said earlier, is well below national averages. And in the past year, the village has selected and begun working with a new health insurance consultant. And with their assistance, along with a strong interdepartmental wellness team that was recently created, we have kicked off an aggressive wellness initiative that really, as its goal, strives to control a lot of those health insurance costs going forward, but again, at the same time, promote employee well-being throughout our employee population. So at this time, I'll take any questions or comments on the health insurance fund.
Questions or comments on health insurance? Healthy presentation.
We hope so. We hope it stays that way. Moving on to the
We'll
risk.
take public comments on both items once we get through them.
Moving on to the risk management fund, we have seen expenses drop in this fund from $2.1 million in 2012 to a budgeted amount of $1.5 million for 2013. This fund is more susceptible to fluctuations in claims activity that will occur from year to year. But similar to the health fund, there has been a strong focus on controlling costs and promoting employee safety and well-being. And this has been done through new contractual relationships and new safety initiatives. So at this time, I'll take any questions or comments on this fund.
Any questions or comments from the council? I just want to add my voice and appreciation to not just the legal department and the risk management department when it comes to managing these sometimes very difficult sources of expense to the organization. I know that, and we all know that a lot of efforts have been undertaken in recent years to try to keep these expenses as managed as possible, and I think they've been very successful, and I don't know if they're celebrated as much as they probably should. But it actually goes beyond that. I know that there have been efforts undertaken by all departments to try to manage risk better, and that's all greatly appreciated because we can predict and project and calculate a lot of things, but this is the one area, as was mentioned, that oftentimes can fluctuate wildly, and you can't keep your eye off it for 1 second. It's important for any organization to manage risk, and I appreciate everyone's efforts in doing that throughout the organization.
Is it safe to say that these reductions are part and parcel to some of the lean concepts that we're going through?
Absolutely.
I know there's been a lot of interdepartmental cooperation and connection and whatever the other C word that Maritelli likes to use that I can't remember right now.
Communication, collaboration, cooperation.
To keep going, but I think that this is a nice spot to say, you know, this is where it's working, and this is where we're seeing some actually pretty significant numbers in cost savings and reductions.
I'll really call out Shanae Mackey and our team that works closely with Enza and Dawn in the legal department. The movement in risk, our focus on risk and cost reduction is throughout the organization. We've done better so far. We'll continue to do better in the future, and sort of a hidden expense area, and we're calling a focus and attention to it through the application of lean processes, and so far so good.
Right, and these are significant dollars, so we spend a lot of attention on things far less than this. I want to underscore the importance of this area and appreciate all the efforts. Any questions or comments from any members of the audience with respect to health insurance and risk management? Thank you.
We'll move along to the next two funds, fleet services and equipment replacement. So turning to beginning on page 4-10. Again, these funds behave similarly. You know, revenues come into these funds as charges from user departments, most of which are accounted for in the general fund. Those revenues are used to support ongoing fleet operations and the plan for the replacement of equipment that will fluctuate from year to year because of the varying purchase cost of the equipment that's due for replacement. Again, another slide that looks similar. Referencing page 4-10, the Fleet Services Fund to begin with. The expenses in the Fleet Services Fund have risen slightly from $1.7 to $1.8 million in the 2013 budget, mostly attributable to rising personnel costs. Over the past several years, however, our efforts to maintain the fleet in a more sustainable and innovative manner have grown. We have a fleet that includes a significant, a high percentage of alternative fuel vehicles, which is critical in our efforts to reduce fuel consumption. And additionally, the size of the fleet has been reduced by over 10% in the past several years. Are there any questions or comments related to this fund?
Questions or comments? I don't want to sound overly gushing, and I certainly don't want to sound comfortable, but I also want to celebrate. But I think this is another area where, A, the village has really been a leader when it comes to alternative fuel use and has been recognized nationally for that. And again, that's greatly appreciated, and I think a very good path that we're on. But second of all, speaking of that lean mentality and being innovative in terms of partnering with others, we've already scored some major successes here, and those are the kind of things that we can have to continue to do because expenses will continue to rise. Any questions or comments on this from any members of the audience? Fleet services?
We'll turn now to equipment replacement on page 4-12, where it begins. In the equipment replacement fund, expenses are increasing from $1.2 million in the 2012 estimate to $1.7 million in the 2013 budget. 2013 happens to be one of those years when the total cost of planned replacements is higher than usual, meaning that we will be drawing down on the fund balance slightly. Vehicles and equipment identified in the budget for replacement are determined based on a well-established yet flexible plan. And the interdepartmental team that has been established meets routinely throughout the year, reviews equipment replacement bids before they're released in order to ensure that they are necessary and designed to meet the specific service-related need. Are there any questions or comments in this area?
If you flip one more page, where I think Sean's got it open there.
Yeah.
Yeah, we do provide the list of planned purchases for 2013, which includes vehicles, fire equipment, and computer equipment.
And this is where I want to highlight. This is just the budgeted plan, and our team has exhibited incredible application of lean concepts where just because it appears on a plan doesn't mean it gets purchased. We have stretched the lives of vehicles, we have changed vehicles, we have right-sized vehicles, we've reduced the size of the fleet, and that's really the story. So just because it appears in this budget, it means that it's on the plan. Just because it's on the plan doesn't mean we're going to purchase it next year.
And to your point, Dave, what was it, last week or the week before, we replaced a number of computers. That's something that would appear on the list, so.
As they do, we're replacing the fire department.
Right,
Yeah.
so I mean, you come up with the replacement, it comes before us, and so even though staff is recommending that we do the replacement, it comes before council, and we actually ask the same questions again and again, do we really have to? So,
Exactly.
there's a lot of checks and balances in here.
I see that we have the fire tough books and laptops. Seems like there's a lot of technology in the computer industry that we're looking at here. Have we looked at leasing these things versus buying them?
We have looked at leasing them. In the last couple of years, if you remember, there was a very large focus on whether we should continue to operate the equipment replacement fund like we do, which is, create a balance that, puts in a similar amount every year, and then we draw up and down based on fluctuating expenses. Or should we go to a lease and rely on a bank or financial institution to help us manage our cash flow like that? After an extensive review in the last 2 years, we found that we are in a position to actually do it less expensively ourselves through the management of this fleet fund, equipment replacement fund. You may remember that discussion culminated in the discussion when we talked about replacement of the ladder truck.
Yeah, but I'm not talking about equipment. I'm talking about technology like computers. And I'm not looking at leasing because we don't have the cash and need a bank to do it. I'm looking at it because the life expectancy of these things is what? The technology is constantly changing. And this is, $200,000, $300,000 here. Plus, what did we just spend on police? 200 and something? Wasn't that 190, 200? So you start adding up all these zeros, they become real money. You're at $500,000 just in computers, Dave.
Right.
So I'd like to know if we've looked at just specifically the technology side of the computer industry, not fire trucks or police cars or
Right.
anything. I mean, because that, I understand why we do
Right.
what we do.
Yeah,
We will
this-
continue
This
to-
question actually came up,
Yeah.
it's a good one, because I think it came up when we had the review and approval of the new tough books for the police
Yeah.
department.
And I don't think I was at that meeting.
So we talked about how we're looking at new technologies all the time. We're talking about a shift to tablet technology,
Right.
a shift that is related to our computer-aided dispatching. When that change happens, we may be able to continue a trend of less expensive, more highly capable technology. Chief Jackson in the break can probably give you a story about how we've implemented the use of iPad tablets in fire prevention, and it's cut down on administrative
Three of us
costs
here
like
already
crazy.
have them, so, not including staff.
So
yeah.
this is a great example of it. It shows here in the budget and on the plan, but by the time we get to this, we will have fully vetted that and have those questions answered for you.
And these cars that we're looking at replacing, especially the police side of it, these are recommendations. These aren't actually, we're replacing, we're not buying just Fords or anything, are we? These are just what we're replacing, correct?
That's what we're replacing, and then we do a full investigation.
Because
of
I
what the-
gave the police chief an article I read
Yeah.
about the Chicago, or not Chicago, what's built in Chicago, the Ford.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I forgot what they call it. The new police car. It's got like 200 sensors in a second, so you can't
Yeah.
just fishtail or whatever, so.
You just wanna make sure-
Fishtail, but just one compliment that I do want to make.
We
is
want to
that
reduce
This
fishtailing.
list has really gotten shorter. I remember when I first
Absolutely.
came up here, I think it was two full pages of stuff.
Yeah.
There's no heavy equipment here, and now it's just like
Yeah.
police and cars and technology and computers, so.
Thank you. It's one of our biggest success stories, this area.
Dave, some of the equipment replacement, the change in new technology, if you look on 512, and we're talking about the Information Services Department, those are the objectives.
Yeah.
So this reflects what the changes are, but if I could jump ahead there, I was just to understand the VDI, what's virtual desktop infrastructure?
We can get you a report on that, Commissioner
Okay.
Waldeck. It's just the ongoing changing of technology to try to have less computing power at your desk and more computing power in the cloud and the central.
It's a bigger shift of
Karen.
infrastructure to the cloud
Right.
away from, you're trying to keep your hardware costs down by reducing, basically you're just getting a portal. You don't need to invest as much in the recurring
Which
hardware.
affects our equipment replacement, so.
Very much.
But I just didn't understand what all that was, but, it relates to the equipment replacement fund, so I just thought I'd ask while we're there.
Absolutely.
Thanks.
It wouldn't be a budget hearing unless I questioned a car, which is always either a police or a fire one. The Explorer, We've done this on many occasions. I know because of the size of the equipment, they need certain size cars in order to put all that stuff in it. The question I do have, though, is does it have to be an Explorer, or can they look at something like a Highlander that has alternative fuels and stuff like that? I mean, so this is...
That's exactly our point, is that it shows up on a list because we need to budget a number and we have to say which one we're replacing. But we right size, we downsize, we change to alternative fuels. So all those questions will be fully asked and answered. And the list of replacement may look a lot different than the vehicle we're replacing.
But that's
It can
fine. It's just
transfer
more,
from-
I think, an Explorer or the bigger SUVs
Yeah.
guzzle a lot of gas.
Right.
Whereas if you have, whatever you call it, hybrid,
Yeah.
they seem to take less gas.
Correct.
So I was just wondering, as long as, I'm sure we do that, and we've gotten a lot less of them over the years that I've been up here.
Yeah.
But, and I have had explanations as to why they need a certain size.
You
My
won't-
concern is guzzling as much gas as those
Yeah.
cars do.
Yeah, you'll see us talk more about options available to us that are consistent with the greening of the fleets and the fuel reduction. And so it probably won't be an Explorer. It might be now that we've talked about it, but
No, it's just, again, I think it goes back to, I think what Sean said, is it really a Crown Vic, or is it a
Yeah.
whatever? Or is it an
Exactly.
Explorer, or is it a Highlander? I mean,
Again, I think we're just listing what is being
Right.
replaced, not what will be
What we'll
replaced by.
well, it used to be, what was here was it, and.
yeah, we used to put the replacement vehicle, so it was sort of
You
predetermined.
could almost put the
Right.
serial number down.
Right, and it was almost ready to be ordered as soon as the council
Yeah.
blessed it. We've totally leaned up that concept that says,
Okay.
can we do better? Can we buy something cheaper?
That's fine.
Can we change?
Can I ask a question back on fleet services? So, where is the revenue showing from our intergovernmental agreements when they come and visit us? Is it in sales or?
Yeah,
Fees, charges, and fines.
Okay.
Which is what row, Judy? Row 8?
Row
7, 8.
I was thinking it would be in intergovernmental revenues, but I see.
That would be too logical to call an intergovernmental revenue an intergovernmental revenue.
Well, that was, I thought that was row 7,
Okay, thanks.
the sales.
That's from the joint purchasing of fuel. So they help, the other government agencies that
I'm sorry.
participate,
Yeah,
they
that's
help
right.
buy
There it
fuel
was.
in one row, but when we charge them for service in their vehicle, it shows
Right.
up in row 8.
It's my glasses.
Any other questions on equipment replacement? Any questions from the audience with respect to equipment replacement? Please. Good morning.
Good morning, Anthony Chang from 5507 Aubrey Terrace. I kind of inferred CNG, I'm assuming means compressed natural gas, but maybe in the future just putting like, hey, this is what it is.
It's a great idea.
We love acronyms.
Yes, it's all helpful when we all understand what the acronym is. On regards to some of these replacements, do we have like a more of a detailed listing of the reason why it's like maybe a standard form we're choosing to replace this asset due to, this car has, a transmission that's faulty over the
Yes.
X number of years? Is there like a standard form that we can look at, see this is being referenced, to reference it?
There is not a standard form, but we can put that information out on our website. It's exactly what you'd think. We look at maintenance records, we look at total expense curves, and when that curve gets to the point where it's cheaper to buy a replacement vehicle than it is to maintain an old one, then we switch.
All right, that'd be helpful.
Yeah.
Also, looking at technology replacements, do we have like a comprehensive like 5-year strategy on our IT? And is there a place where we can look that information up so we can kind of, some of us who work in the industry, it'd be helpful to understand what the 5-year vision is for it, and maybe see if we can analyze it based on what our best practices are.
That's actually a topic that we discuss routinely with our technology commission, and we can certainly get that information available to residents on the web. But it is discussed. It's certainly information we can make available.
Right, and the Technology Commission actually assists in inputting on ideas for how to keep technology costs both on the cutting edge, maybe not the bleeding edge, but the cutting edge, and also manage those costs, because obviously technology is very important, as we all know, but it can also come at a cost, and trying to keep that balance is something that the Technology Commission weighs in on, and we have a lot of very talented and informed residents who volunteer their time in that respect, and it's very valuable.
Okay.
We should talk to you about information about that commission. You seem very interested.
I
Contact.
really appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Break. Thank you.
Also on the website.
Yeah.
Thank you. Any other questions from the audience?
We will very quickly then finish up with police pension and fire pension, which are on pages
16?
416.
416. I believe we've covered all these points again, but I will reiterate a few of them because I think they're worth mentioning. These police and fire pension funds are managed by autonomous pension boards. They are not managed by the staff or the village council. The people that sit on those boards are there because of the way the state law says we have to set up and manage those boards. The village council does not actually control the pension fund budgets. Why are they in the budget book? Because they are what's called trust and agency accounts or funds, and they are placed here because really the village has a core competency of operating the financial mechanisms behind the scene, and so we are entrusted with their funds, but they make the decisions. Those boards make the decisions. Well, how do we affect costs in the pension funds? We affect expenses through the decisions we make in staffing levels and salaries, and that equates directly to service levels that Jeff was just talking about earlier. We can control costs by making sure that our staffing levels are only what we need to provide the desired service levels, and we have a great success story in those areas. Commissioner Schnell asked me earlier about, to tell a little story about the pension funds. Are they financially sound? This is what I said earlier. Yes, they are. They are in great financial position. They are well managed, and the village contributes 100% of the required contributions. So normally I'd ask if there's any questions or comments on these funds in the budget, but really the question is back to any questions about the levy, because that's the only thing we really can talk about in this context.
Right, and we, as you mentioned, we have sort of already talked about these pensions earlier in the day, but are there any questions at this juncture from members of the council? Any questions on the police or fire pensions from any members of the audience? Within what we can control? All right, thank you. And it would be 8:20 at this point in time. We have a break scheduled.
9:20.
Wow.
I don't want the public thinking we sped through this in 20 minutes.
No, we started at 7. It would now be 9:20. I'm sorry, I was in the wrong time zone. It's now 9:20.
Where are you?
Poor guy. Lombard, I'll escort you.
We're all leading up to the fact that we're going to take a brief break at this point in time. So we'll come back in, should we say 10 minutes? Come back in 10 minutes.
Here,
Thank you.
Can we talk about the equipment replacement fund?